Declassified. February 15, 1943. The windswept hills of Tunisia stretched endlessly under a pale winter sky, their rocky surfaces scarred by weeks of artillery bombardment and tank tracks. Staff Sergeant Marcus Mac Henderson crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, his Springfield M1903A4 rifle cradled against his shoulder, peering through what remained of his rifle scope. The lens had developed a spiderweb crack 3 days earlier when shrapnel from a German 88mm shell had showered his position, and standard procedure dictated he should have requested a replacement immediately. Instead, Henderson had made a discovery that would revolutionize American sniper tactics and turn him into one of the most feared marksmen in the European theater. The morning air carried the acrid smell of cordite and diesel fuel from the valley below, where the remnants of the 1st Infantry Division had been pinned down for 6 brutal days. German MG-42 machine gun nests, expertly positioned along the ridgeline opposite Henderson's position, had turned the narrow pass into a killing field. Every attempt to advance had been met with devastating crossfire that cut down American soldiers before they could find adequate cover. The distinctive rapid-fire chatter of the German weapons echoed across the valley like a mechanical death rattle, punctuated by the deeper boom of Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets and the whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Henderson adjusted his position slightly, feeling the rough stone scrape against his wool uniform. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he studied the enemy positions through his damaged scope. What he saw should have been a blur of distorted images, fractured and multiplied by the crack running diagonally across his optic. Instead, he had learned to use that crack as an unexpected advantage, a discovery so counterintuitive that when he first mentioned it to his spotter, Private Tommy Chen, the young soldier had assumed the stress of combat had affected Henderson's judgment. The German positions were formidable. Intelligence reports indicated at least 47 enemy soldiers manning 7 machine gun nests, 3 mortar positions, and 2 anti-tank gun emplacements. They had been reinforced during the night with additional ammunition and supplies, dropped by parachute under cover of darkness. Each position was expertly camouflaged and protected by natural rock formations that made direct assault nearly impossible. Previous attempts by Allied forces had resulted in catastrophic casualties, 38 men killed and 62 wounded in just 2 days of failed attacks. But Henderson had noticed something others had missed. During his hours of observation through his cracked scope, he had discovered that the fracture in his lens created a unique optical phenomenon. The crack didn't just distort his view, it actually provided him with multiple perspectives of the same target simultaneously. While his primary field of view showed the enemy position straight ahead, the fractured portion of the lens revealed angles and approaches that would normally be invisible. It was as if he had developed a form of visual sonar, able to see around corners and identify vulnerabilities that remained hidden to conventional observation. The realization had come gradually, built up through days of patient observation and careful note-taking. Henderson had always been methodical, a trait inherited from his father who had worked as a precision machinist in Detroit before the war. This mechanical precision, combined with his natural marksmanship abilities honed during years of hunting deer in the Michigan wilderness, had made him one of the most effective snipers in his regiment. But the broken scope had elevated his capabilities to something approaching the supernatural. As he watched the German positions, Henderson counted the routine movements of the enemy soldiers. Every 18 minutes, the machine gunner in the primary nest would shift positions to avoid counter-battery fire. Every 23 minutes, a runner would move between positions carrying messages and ammunition. Every 37 minutes, the commanding officer would emerge from his bunker to conduct visual reconnaissance of the American positions below. These patterns had become as familiar to Henderson as the rhythm of his own heartbeat, and he had learned to predict them with mechanical precision. The stakes could not have been higher. The 1st Infantry Division's advance had stalled completely, with the entire North African campaign hanging in the balance. General Terry Allen had personally visited the forward command post the previous evening, his face grim as he studied the tactical map spread across the makeshift table. The division could not afford to remain pinned down much longer. German reinforcements were moving up from the south, and aerial reconnaissance indicated that panzer units were being repositioned to exploit any weakness in the American lines. Colonel James Morrison, Henderson's commanding officer, had exhausted conventional options. Artillery bombardment had proven ineffective against the well-protected German positions, and close air support had been limited by poor weather conditions and the proximity of American forces to enemy lines. Direct assault had been attempted twice, each time resulting in devastating casualties with no meaningful progress. The narrow geography of the pass created a natural bottleneck that favored the defenders, and German commanders had maximized every advantage provided by the terrain. Yet Henderson remained confident that his unconventional discovery could change everything. The broken scope that should have rendered him ineffective had instead transformed him into a weapon unlike any other in the American arsenal. Through the fractured lens, he could see the invisible threads connecting the German defensive network, the precise timing of their movements, and most importantly, the single point of failure that could bring down their entire position. It seemed impossible, almost mystical, but Henderson had spent enough time in these hills to trust what he was seeing. Private Chen shifted nervously beside him, checking his range cards for the 100th time that morning. The young soldier had been Henderson's spotter for 3 months, ever since arriving as a replacement after the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Despite his youth and relative inexperience, Chen had proven invaluable, his sharp eyes and steady nerves complementing Henderson's methodical approach perfectly. But even Chen had expressed doubts about Henderson's plan, questioning whether the broken scope was really providing accurate information or creating dangerous illusions. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of Lieutenant Robert Walsh, the platoon's forward observer. Walsh had been coordinating with artillery units all morning, trying to develop some form of fire support that could dislodge the German positions without endangering American forces in the valley below. His face bore the exhaustion and frustration of a man who had run out of conventional solutions. As he slid into position beside Henderson and Chen, his equipment rattling softly against the stone wall, he carried with him the weight of command decisions that would determine the fate of hundreds of men. The German machine gun opened fire again, its measured bursts echoing across the valley as it engaged targets Henderson couldn't see from his position. Somewhere below, American soldiers were diving for cover, calling for medics, fighting for their lives against an enemy that seemed untouchable and perfectly positioned. The futility of the situation was evident in every burst of gunfire, every call for help that crackled across the radio frequencies, every casualty report that made its way back to the command post. But Henderson had seen something in his broken scope that would change all of that. In 12 days, his innovation would make him 4 times more effective than any sniper in the theater, revolutionizing how American marksmen engaged enemy positions and saving countless lives in the process. The crack in his lens, which should have ended his effectiveness as a sniper, would instead become the foundation of a technique so powerful that it would be classified and studied by military analysts for decades after the war. Marcus Henderson had grown up in the industrial heart of Detroit, where the rhythm of factory machinery provided the soundtrack to daily life, and precision engineering was not just a profession but a way of understanding the world. His father, William Henderson, had worked for 32 years at the Ford River Rouge complex, starting as an apprentice machinist in 1910 and eventually becoming a supervisor responsible for the most delicate engine components. The Henderson family lived in a modest 2-story house on Gresham Avenue, where the walls vibrated gently whenever the massive stamping presses at the nearby Chrysler plant operated during night shifts. From his earliest memories, Marcus had been fascinated by the intersection of precision and function that defined his father's work. During school vacations, William would sometimes bring his son to the factory floor, where Marcus would watch in amazement as massive machines shaped raw metal into components with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The older Henderson would explain how even the smallest deviation from specifications could cause an entire engine to fail, how every measurement mattered, and how understanding the relationship between seemingly unrelated parts was essential to creating something that worked perfectly. This mechanical mindset had naturally extended to Marcus's childhood interests. While other boys his age played baseball or collected comic books, Marcus spent his afternoons in the family garage, disassembling and reassembling whatever mechanical devices he could find. Alarm clocks, radios, his mother's sewing machine, nothing was safe from his curiosity about how things worked. His mother, Helen Henderson, initially worried about her son's obsessive focus on machinery, but she came to understand that this was simply how Marcus made sense of the world around him. The precision that Marcus developed in his father's workshop found its perfect expression during family hunting trips to northern Michigan. Every autumn, the Henderson men would drive to a small cabin near Grayling, where William's brother owned 40 acres of hardwood forest. It was during these trips that Marcus first held a rifle, learning to appreciate the mechanical precision required for accurate marksmanship. His father taught him that shooting was simply another form of precision engineering, understanding the relationship between breath control, trigger pressure, sight alignment, and environmental conditions. By the time Marcus turned 16, he could consistently place shots within a 2-inch group at 200 yards, a level of accuracy that impressed even experienced hunters in the area. But more importantly, he had developed an almost intuitive understanding of how external factors affected bullet trajectory. He could compensate for wind speed and direction, account for temperature and humidity variations, and adjust for the subtle differences in ammunition performance that most shooters never noticed. When the attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into World War II, Marcus was working as a junior machinist at the Willow Run plant, where Ford was producing B-24 Liberator bombers for the war effort. The work was essential to the war effort, and his draft deferment allowed him to continue contributing to aircraft production while many of his friends enlisted in various military branches. However, the mechanical precision of factory work felt increasingly meaningless as reports from the Pacific and European theaters emphasized the desperate need for skilled soldiers. The decision to enlist came during the spring of 1942, following news that his best friend from high school, David Patterson, had been killed during the Bataan Death March. Patterson had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor, driven by patriotic fervor and a desire for adventure that Marcus had initially found admirable but impractical. The news of Patterson's death, delivered by his grieving mother during a chance encounter at the local grocery store, forced Marcus to confront the reality that his mechanical skills might be more valuable on the battlefield than in the factory. William Henderson had initially opposed his son's decision to enlist, arguing that defense production was equally important and far safer than combat duty. The older man had served briefly during World War I, arriving in France just weeks before the armistice, and he understood the realities of warfare better than most civilians. But Marcus felt compelled by a sense of responsibility that transcended personal safety or family concerns. His precision and mechanical understanding could save lives and help end the war more quickly. Basic training at Camp Croft in South Carolina had been a revelation for Marcus, though not always in ways he had expected. The physical conditioning proved challenging initially, as years of factory work had built upper body strength but neglected cardiovascular endurance. The South Carolina heat and humidity created conditions unlike anything he had experienced in Michigan, and the demanding pace of military training left him exhausted and occasionally questioning his decision to enlist. However, when training progressed to marksmanship instruction, Marcus's natural abilities immediately distinguished him from his fellow recruits. His first session at the rifle range produced scores that drill instructors initially suspected of being recording errors. While most recruits struggled to hit man-sized targets at 100 yards, Marcus was consistently placing shots in the bullseye at 200 yards, using iron sights and standard-issue ammunition. His shooting position was textbook perfect, his breathing controlled and methodical, and his trigger squeeze so smooth that even experienced marksmen stopped to watch his technique. Sergeant First Class Raymond Torres, the company's senior marksmanship instructor, had served 2 tours in the Philippines before the war and had trained hundreds of soldiers in rifle techniques. Torres recognized exceptional talent when he saw it, and Marcus Henderson possessed natural abilities that occurred perhaps once in every 1,000 recruits. More importantly, Henderson approached shooting with the analytical mindset that Torres had seen in the very best snipers, treating each shot as a problem to be solved rather than simply hoping for good results. The near disaster came during advanced field training exercises, when Marcus's mechanical precision actually worked against him during a simulated combat scenario. While other soldiers adapted quickly to the chaos and improvisation required in battlefield conditions, Marcus became paralyzed by the variables he couldn't control or calculate precisely. During one particularly challenging exercise, his squad was pinned down by simulated enemy fire, and Marcus spent crucial minutes trying to calculate exact ranges and environmental conditions rather than engaging targets effectively. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Stevens, the battalion commander overseeing the training exercise, initially concluded that Henderson lacked the adaptability required for combat operations. Stevens had commanded a rifle company during the final months of World War I and understood that battlefield success often depended more on quick decision-making than perfect execution. He recommended that Henderson be transferred to a support role where his mechanical skills could be utilized without the unpredictability of direct combat. However, Captain Robert Mitchell, who had been observing Henderson's performance throughout basic training, requested a private meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Stevens to discuss Henderson's potential. Mitchell had noticed that Henderson's apparent inflexibility was actually a form of advanced pattern recognition. The young soldier was processing far more environmental data than most people could handle, and his analytical approach simply required more time to reach its full potential. Mitchell argued that with proper mentoring and additional training, Henderson could become one of the most effective soldiers in the battalion. The mentoring came from Gunnery Sergeant Paul Murphy, a veteran of the Banana Wars who had served in Nicaragua and Haiti during the 1920s and 1930s. Murphy had extensive experience training snipers for jungle warfare, and he understood that the best marksmen were often those who could combine natural talent with analytical thinking. Murphy worked with Henderson during off-duty hours, teaching him how to make rapid assessments of battlefield conditions while maintaining the precision that made him exceptional. Murphy's training focused on developing Henderson's intuitive responses to changing conditions, helping him understand that battlefield accuracy was different from range accuracy. They practiced shooting from improvised positions, engaging multiple targets in rapid succession, and making range estimations under time pressure. Most importantly, Murphy taught Henderson to trust his instincts and accept that perfect information was rarely available in combat situations. By the end of advanced training, Henderson had transformed from a mechanically precise but inflexible shooter into a versatile marksman capable of adapting his skills to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. His scores on practical shooting exercises were consistently among the highest in the battalion, and his analytical approach to problem-solving had become an asset rather than a liability. When orders arrived assigning him to the 1st Infantry Division as a designated marksman, both Murphy and Mitchell were confident that Henderson would prove himself in combat. The deployment to North Africa had been Henderson's first exposure to actual warfare, and the reality of combat had been both more and less intense than he had anticipated. The mechanical aspects of soldiering, maintaining equipment, following procedures, executing tactical movements, came naturally to him and provided a familiar framework for operating in an unfamiliar environment. However, the human cost of warfare, the random nature of death and injury, and the emotional toll of constant vigilance had challenged him in ways that no training could have fully prepared him for. His first confirmed kill had come during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, when German forces had launched a surprise offensive that caught American forces unprepared and resulted in significant casualties. Henderson had been positioned on a ridge overlooking the main approach route, and his precision shooting had been instrumental in slowing the German advance long enough for American forces to organize a defense. The technical aspects of the engagement had been straightforward: range estimation, environmental compensation, target selection, but the human reality of taking a life had affected him more deeply than he had expected. The North African campaign had provided Henderson with extensive combat experience and confirmed his abilities as an exceptional marksman. His reputation had grown within the division, and he had been assigned increasingly challenging missions that took advantage of his unique combination of technical skill and analytical thinking. However, it was the broken scope that would transform him from a highly effective sniper into something approaching a legend, creating opportunities that conventional wisdom suggested should have been impossible. The rugged terrain of Tunisia presented challenges that tested every aspect of Henderson's training and experience. The rocky hills and narrow valleys created complex fields of fire that required precise range estimation and careful consideration of bullet trajectory. German forces had proven themselves masters of defensive positioning, utilizing natural terrain features to maximum advantage and creating overlapping fields of fire that made conventional assault tactics extremely costly. The German defensive position that had pinned down the 1st Infantry Division represented the culmination of months of tactical evolution and adaptation. Oberstfighter Klaus Weber, the German non-commissioned officer commanding the primary machine gun nest, had served on the Eastern Front for 18 months before being transferred to North Africa. Weber's experience fighting Soviet forces had taught him the importance of creating defensive positions that could withstand both direct assault and artillery bombardment while maintaining fields of fire that covered all likely approach routes. Weber's machine gun nest was positioned behind a natural rock formation that provided protection from direct fire while allowing his MG-42 to cover the entire valley floor. The position had been carefully prepared over several days, with ammunition stored in protected locations and backup positions identified in case the primary site became untenable. Weber had also established communication with supporting positions, creating a coordinated defense that could respond effectively to threats from multiple directions. The supporting positions included mortar teams positioned to provide indirect fire support, anti-tank guns covering the most likely routes for armored vehicles, and rifle squads positioned to engage infantry attempting to advance through areas not covered by machine gun fire. Each position was expertly camouflaged and protected by natural terrain features that made identification and engagement extremely difficult for attacking forces. German artillery spotters positioned on the highest peaks provided real-time intelligence about American troop movements and could direct accurate fire on any concentration of attacking forces. These observers had been equipped with excellent optical equipment and communication systems that allowed them to coordinate defensive fires with remarkable precision. Their elevated positions made them nearly impossible to approach without being detected, and previous American attempts to neutralize them had failed with significant casualties. The coordination between German positions created a defensive network that was greater than the sum of its individual components. Machine gun fires were coordinated to create overlapping beaten zones that eliminated dead space where attacking forces might find cover. Mortar fires were pre-planned to cover likely assault routes and could be delivered within minutes of observer requests. Anti-tank positions were sited to engage American armor at ranges where German weapons had maximum effectiveness while minimizing exposure to return fire. American attempts to overcome this defensive network had followed conventional tactical doctrine but had failed to achieve meaningful results. Direct assault had been attempted twice, with infantry advancing under covering fire from available artillery and mortar support. Both attempts had been repulsed with heavy casualties, as German defenders had been able to engage American forces in killing fields where maneuver was extremely limited and cover was minimal. Artillery bombardment had been tried extensively, but the rocky terrain and well-prepared German positions had limited its effectiveness. German defenders had constructed overhead protection that reduced casualties from artillery fragments, and their positions were sufficiently dispersed to prevent concentrated fires from neutralizing multiple positions simultaneously. Counter-battery fire had been attempted against German artillery positions, but the mountainous terrain made location and engagement of these targets extremely difficult. Close air support had been requested but had been limited by poor weather conditions and the proximity of American forces to German positions. Fighter-bomber aircraft had made several attempts to engage German positions, but the accuracy required to avoid hitting American forces had limited the effectiveness of these attacks. Additionally, German anti-aircraft positions in the area had made low-level attack runs extremely hazardous. The tactical situation had reached a stalemate that favored the German defenders and threatened to disrupt the entire Allied offensive in North Africa. American forces could neither advance nor withdraw without significant casualties, while German forces were able to maintain their positions with minimal losses. Time favored the Germans, as reinforcements were reportedly moving to the area and would arrive within days. Intelligence reports indicated that German commanders were planning to transition from defensive operations to a limited offensive designed to drive American forces from the area entirely. Intercepted communications suggested that additional artillery units were being positioned to support this offensive, and aerial reconnaissance had identified increased German supply activity in the region. It was during this desperate tactical situation that Henderson began to notice patterns in German defensive operations that others had missed. His methodical observation through the broken scope had revealed timing patterns in German activities that created brief windows of vulnerability. These patterns were subtle and required hours of careful observation to identify, but they represented the first potential solution to what had appeared to be an impossible tactical problem. Henderson's broken scope had initially appeared to be a significant disadvantage that would reduce his effectiveness as a sniper. The crack running diagonally across the lens created visual distortions that conventional wisdom suggested would make accurate shooting impossible. Standard operating procedures required that damaged optical equipment be replaced immediately, as the reliability of equipment was considered essential for maintaining the precision required in sniper operations. However, Henderson's analytical approach to problem solving had led him to experiment with the damaged scope rather than simply requesting a replacement. His mechanical background had taught him that sometimes equipment failures created unexpected opportunities, and his experience with precision manufacturing had shown him that apparent defects sometimes revealed hidden capabilities. The first step in Henderson's innovation involved understanding exactly how the crack in his scope lens affected the optical properties of the system. Rather than creating simple distortion, the crack actually created a complex optical phenomenon similar to a prism effect. Light entering the scope was split and redirected by the crack, creating multiple images of the same target from slightly different angles. This prismatic effect meant that Henderson could simultaneously observe a target from his primary line of sight while also seeing the same target from perspectives that were offset by several degrees. The crack essentially provided him with multiple observation points without requiring him to physically move his position. This capability was unprecedented and offered tactical advantages that had never been available to conventional snipers. The second component of Henderson's technique involved learning to interpret the multiple images created by the fractured lens. Initially, the overlapping and offset images were confusing and seemed to make accurate shooting impossible. However, through hours of careful observation and practice, Henderson learned to use the different perspectives to gain a more complete understanding of target positions and movements. The offset images revealed aspects of target positions that were invisible from conventional observation points. German soldiers who appeared to be completely concealed when viewed through the primary optic were partially visible through the fractured portion of the lens. This allowed Henderson to identify targets that would normally be considered impossible to engage and to plan shooting solutions for positions that appeared to offer complete protection. The third element of Henderson's innovation was developing a shooting technique that could utilize the information provided by the fractured scope. This required him to essentially learn to shoot using two different aiming points simultaneously, one provided by the primary optic and another provided by the fractured portion of the lens. The mathematical relationships between these aiming points were complex and varied depending on range and target position. Henderson's mechanical background proved invaluable in working out these mathematical relationships. He approached the problem like an engineering challenge, carefully measuring and recording the relationships between the different images created by the fractured lens. Through systematic experimentation, he developed a series of mathematical formulas that allowed him to predict where bullets would impact based on the different aiming references provided by his damaged scope. The materials required for Henderson's technique were surprisingly simple and consisted primarily of items that were readily available in field conditions. The fractured scope itself was the primary component, but Henderson also created a series of reference cards that contained the mathematical calculations required for different shooting scenarios. These cards were waterproofed and organized in a system that allowed for rapid consultation during combat operations. Henderson also modified his shooting position and equipment setup to optimize the use of his fractured scope. He created a more stable shooting rest using materials salvaged from battlefield debris, and he modified his ammunition storage system to allow for more rapid reloading between shots. These modifications were subtle but essential for maximizing the tactical advantages provided by his optical innovation. The process of sourcing and improvising materials had required considerable creativity and resourcefulness. Henderson had salvaged materials from damaged vehicles, abandoned equipment, and even German positions that had been overrun during previous operations. His mechanical background had taught him to see potential uses for items that others might consider worthless, and he had assembled his improved shooting system using components that cost nothing and were readily available. Secret testing of Henderson's technique had been conducted during off-duty hours and in locations where his activities would not attract attention from command personnel. Henderson understood that his unconventional approach would likely be rejected by officers who were trained in conventional tactics, so he needed to prove the effectiveness of his technique before presenting it as a viable option. The testing process had involved setting up makeshift targets at various ranges and attempting to engage them using the fractured scope technique. Henderson had been able to achieve accuracy that matched or exceeded his performance with conventional optics, despite the apparent disadvantage of using damaged equipment. More importantly, he had been able to engage targets from positions and angles that would have been impossible using conventional sighting systems. Henderson had also conducted observational tests, using his fractured scope to gather intelligence about German positions and activities. These tests had revealed information that was not available through conventional observation methods, including the identification of concealed positions and the detection of movement patterns that were invisible to standard reconnaissance techniques. Refinements to Henderson's technique had been made after each test session, with adjustments to his mathematical calculations, improvements to his equipment setup, and modifications to his shooting procedures. Each refinement had improved the effectiveness of the system and increased Henderson's confidence that his innovation could provide significant tactical advantages in combat operations. The physics and engineering principles underlying Henderson's technique were based on well-established optical phenomena, but their application to sniper operations was entirely unprecedented. The fractured lens created multiple optical paths that provided different perspectives on the same target area, essentially giving Henderson the ability to observe from multiple positions simultaneously without physically moving. This multi-perspective capability allowed Henderson to identify weak points in German defensive positions that were invisible from any single observation point. German soldiers who appeared to be completely protected when viewed from one angle were partially exposed when viewed from the alternative perspective provided by the fractured scope. This information allowed Henderson to plan shooting solutions that conventional tactics would have considered impossible. Expert dismissal of Henderson's proposed technique had been swift and emphatic when he first mentioned it to his commanding officers. Lieutenant Walsh had argued that damaged equipment should never be used in combat operations, as reliability was essential for maintaining unit effectiveness. The idea that broken equipment could actually provide advantages over properly functioning gear contradicted everything that military doctrine taught about equipment maintenance and replacement. Technical experts had pointed out that the visual distortions created by the fractured lens would make accurate range estimation impossible, arguing that Henderson's claimed accuracy was either luck or self-deception. They noted that optical equipment was manufactured to precise specifications for specific reasons, and that any deviation from these specifications would necessarily reduce performance rather than improve it. Tactical experts had argued that Henderson's technique was unnecessarily complex and that conventional sniper techniques had proven effective throughout the war. They pointed out that introducing unproven methods during active combat operations could endanger not only Henderson but also the soldiers depending on his support. The consensus among experienced officers was that Henderson should follow established procedures rather than experimenting with improvised techniques. Despite this expert opposition, Henderson had remained confident in his observations and testing results. His mechanical background had taught him to trust empirical data over theoretical objections, and his testing had consistently demonstrated that his technique provided real advantages over conventional methods. The success of his innovation would ultimately validate his decision to pursue an unconventional solution to what appeared to be an impossible tactical problem. February 27, 1943, dawned cold and overcast, with low-hanging clouds that threatened to limit visibility throughout the day. The rocky hills around the German defensive positions were shrouded in morning mist that created an ethereal quality to the landscape while also providing additional concealment for both attackers and defenders. Henderson had been in position since well before dawn, his body temperature regulated by layers of wool clothing and his breathing controlled to minimize the formation of visible vapor clouds. The German defensive network appeared unchanged from Henderson's previous observations, but he knew that appearances could be deceiving. Through his fractured scope, he conducted a systematic survey of each known position, checking for changes in personnel, equipment placement, or defensive improvements that might affect his planned operation. The multiple perspectives provided by his damaged optic revealed details that would have been invisible through conventional observation methods. Enemy forces in the primary defensive network consisted of approximately 47 personnel organized into 7 distinct positions. The main machine gun nest, commanded by Oberstfreiter Weber, contained 4 soldiers operating an MG-42 machine gun with approximately 2,000 rounds of ammunition. Supporting positions included 3 additional machine gun teams, 2 mortar sections with 81mm mortars, and various rifle squads positioned to cover dead space and provide local security. German artillery spotters remained positioned on the highest peaks surrounding the valley, equipped with excellent optical equipment and radio communication systems that allowed them to direct accurate fire missions within minutes of target identification. These spotters represented a constant threat to any American movement in the area and had been responsible for directing the artillery fires that had disrupted previous assault attempts. The tactical situation facing American forces remained desperate, with the 1st Infantry Division pinned down in positions that offered minimal cover and limited options for maneuver. Previous casualties from German defensive fires had reduced the effective strength of attacking units to approximately 60% of authorized levels, and medical evacuation of wounded personnel had been complicated by continued German observation and interdiction fires. Henderson's final preparations involved checking his equipment, reviewing his calculations, and conducting final observations of target areas through his fractured scope. His rifle had been carefully cleaned and inspected, with special attention paid to the condition of the barrel and the consistency of his ammunition. The fractured scope had been secured in place and its mounting verified to ensure that there would be no shift in zero during extended shooting. Mental preparation was equally important, as Henderson needed to maintain focus and emotional control throughout what would likely be an extended engagement. His experience in previous combat operations had taught him the importance of managing stress and maintaining analytical thinking under pressure. He reviewed his shooting solutions one final time, confirming the mathematical relationships that would guide his target engagement sequence. At precisely 0847 hours, Henderson observed the beginning of the routine personnel movement that he had identified during days of patient observation. A German soldier emerged from the primary bunker to conduct routine maintenance on communication equipment, exposing himself for approximately 30 seconds in a position that was normally considered completely protected from American observation and fire. Through his fractured scope, Henderson could see the target clearly despite the fact that conventional observation methods would have shown only empty terrain. The multiple perspectives provided by his damaged optic revealed the soldier's position and allowed Henderson to calculate a shooting solution that took advantage of the brief window of vulnerability created by the routine maintenance activity. Henderson's first shot was fired at 0848 hours, with the bullet traveling 347 yards through cold, humid air before impacting the target with devastating accuracy. The German soldier was killed instantly, but more importantly, his death occurred in a manner that appeared impossible to the surviving German defenders. From their perspective, the shot had come from an angle and direction that should have been blocked by natural terrain features. The immediate effect of Henderson's shot was confusion and concern among the German defenders, who could not determine the source of the fire that had killed their comrade. Standard counter-sniper procedures required identifying the shooter's position before taking countermeasures, but the apparent trajectory of Henderson's bullet suggested a firing position that visual observation showed to be impossible. German response to the first shot involved increased vigilance and attempts to identify Henderson's position through systematic observation of likely sniper locations. However, their search focused on conventional positions that would normally be used for long-range shooting, and they were unable to locate Henderson's actual position or understand how he had been able to engage a target that appeared to be completely protected. Phase 2 of Henderson's operation began 12 minutes later, when the next scheduled German movement occurred according to the patterns he had identified during his extended observation period. An ammunition runner moved between positions carrying machine gun belts and mortar rounds, following a route that was normally concealed from American observation but was visible through Henderson's fractured scope. Henderson's second shot was even more impressive than his first, as he engaged the moving target at a range of 412 yards while compensating for both the target's movement and the complex ballistic calculations required by his fractured scope technique. The runner was killed instantly, and his death further increased the confusion and concern among German defenders who were now facing an apparently supernatural threat. The cascading effects of Henderson's precision shooting began to manifest as German defensive coordination deteriorated due to losses of key personnel and the psychological impact of facing an enemy who could apparently shoot through solid rock. Communication between positions became erratic as soldiers became reluctant to expose themselves for routine activities, and the efficiency of the defensive network began to decline significantly. Henderson continued his systematic engagement of German positions, using his fractured scope to identify and engage targets that conventional wisdom suggested were impossible to hit. Each shot was planned and executed with mechanical precision, taking advantage of the unique capabilities provided by his damaged optic to achieve results that appeared miraculous to observers on both sides of the conflict. The critical moment when success became clear occurred approximately 47 minutes into Henderson's operation, when the primary German machine gun position ceased effective operation due to casualties among its crew. With the main defensive weapon neutralized, American forces in the valley below were able to begin maneuvering toward more advantageous positions without facing the devastating crossfire that had pinned them down for days. Final results of Henderson's individual action were remarkable by any standard of measurement. In less than 90 minutes of shooting, he had killed or wounded 14 German soldiers, neutralized 3 key defensive positions, and created the tactical opportunity that allowed American forces to break out of their static defensive positions. The precision and effectiveness of his shooting had been unprecedented, and the tactical impact had been far greater than anyone had thought possible from a single sniper. Witness reactions from fellow American soldiers ranged from amazement to disbelief, as they had observed shooting that appeared to violate the basic laws of physics and battlefield geometry. Soldiers who had been pinned down for days by seemingly impregnable German positions watched in astonishment as their tormentors were systematically eliminated by shots that appeared to come from impossible angles. Lieutenant Walsh, who had been skeptical of Henderson's unconventional technique, was forced to acknowledge that the results spoke for themselves. The breakthrough that Henderson had achieved through his individual action had created the opportunity for the entire 1st Infantry Division to resume offensive operations, potentially saving hundreds of American lives and allowing the North African campaign to continue according to schedule. Colonel Morrison's response was immediate and decisive, as he recognized that Henderson's technique represented a significant tactical innovation that could provide advantages in future operations. Morrison ordered that Henderson be given whatever support he needed to continue developing and refining his methods, and he began planning operations that would take maximum advantage of Henderson's unique capabilities. After-action assessment confirmed that Henderson's technique had achieved results that conventional sniper operations would have considered impossible. Intelligence officers who debriefed Henderson were initially skeptical of his claims about using a fractured scope, but examination of the German positions and ballistic evidence confirmed that his shots had indeed been fired from angles that should have been blocked by terrain features. Technical evaluation of Henderson's fractured scope revealed the optical principles underlying his technique, and military engineers began studying whether similar effects could be replicated in properly manufactured equipment. The implications of Henderson's innovation extended far beyond individual marksmanship, suggesting new approaches to battlefield observation and target engagement that could revolutionize military tactics. This engagement marked a fundamental turning point not only in the tactical situation but in Henderson's reputation within the 1st Infantry Division. Word of his impossible shooting spread rapidly throughout the unit, and he began receiving requests for support from commanders facing similar tactical challenges. His broken scope technique had proven itself under the most demanding combat conditions and established him as one of the most effective snipers in the European theater. The official recognition of Henderson's achievement came swiftly and at the highest levels of command. Within 24 hours of his breakthrough engagement, recommendations for commendation had reached division headquarters, and by the end of the week, Henderson had been awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation specifically mentioned his innovative use of damaged equipment to achieve tactical results that conventional methods had failed to accomplish. Henderson's personal response to his sudden fame was characteristically modest and focused on practical considerations rather than personal glory. When questioned by intelligence officers about his technique, he emphasized the systematic observation and mathematical analysis that had made his success possible, downplaying any suggestion that his achievement was based on luck or natural talent alone. His mechanical background had taught him to focus on reproducible results rather than individual performances. The technique began spreading to other units almost immediately, as word of Henderson's success reached sniper instructors and marksmanship specialists throughout the North African theater. However, attempts to replicate his results met with mixed success, as the technique required not only damaged optical equipment but also the analytical skills and mathematical precision that Henderson had developed through his civilian background and extensive practice. Official military adoption of Henderson's fractured scope technique proved challenging, as it contradicted fundamental principles of equipment maintenance and reliability that were central to military doctrine. However, the undeniable effectiveness of the method led to the development of specialized optical equipment that could replicate the multi-perspective capabilities of Henderson's accidentally damaged scope without the inherent unreliability of using broken equipment. Research and development efforts focused on creating prismatic sighting systems that could provide multiple viewing angles simultaneously, essentially building Henderson's accidental discovery into purposefully manufactured equipment. These efforts would eventually result in advanced optical systems that became standard equipment for specialized sniper units, though the original fractured scope technique remained classified for decades after the war. Henderson's post-war life was remarkably similar to his pre-war existence, as he returned to Detroit and resumed work in precision manufacturing. However, his wartime experience had given him a deeper appreciation for the practical applications of mechanical precision, and he eventually established his own machine shop specializing in custom manufacturing for the automotive industry. His business prospered due to his reputation for producing components that exceeded standard tolerances and his ability to solve manufacturing problems that challenged other firms. Despite his wartime achievements, Henderson rarely discussed his military service with civilian friends and colleagues, preferring to focus on current projects rather than past accomplishments. This reticence was partly due to the classified nature of his technique, but it also reflected his practical personality and his belief that past achievements were less important than current contributions. Henderson married his longtime girlfriend, Sarah Mitchell, in 1946, and they raised 3 children while building a successful business together. Sarah had worked in defense production during the war and understood the importance of her husband's contributions, but she also respected his desire to move forward rather than dwelling on wartime experiences. Their marriage was strengthened by shared values of hard work, precision, and practical problem solving. The Henderson family lived quietly in suburban Detroit for 43 years, with Marcus continuing to operate his machine shop until his retirement in 1987. He remained active in community organizations and occasionally spoke at schools about the importance of technical education, though he never discussed his military service in detail. His reputation in the community was based on his contributions to local industry rather than his wartime heroics. Henderson's final years were marked by increasing recognition of his wartime contributions as military historians gained access to previously classified documents. He was invited to speak at several military conferences and was consulted by researchers studying the development of sniper techniques during World War II. However, he remained modest about his achievements and continued to emphasize the importance of systematic analysis and mathematical precision rather than individual heroism. Marcus Henderson died peacefully in his sleep on March 15, 1994, at the age of 74, surrounded by his family and friends who remembered him primarily as a skilled craftsman and devoted family man. His funeral was attended by several hundred people from the Detroit automotive community, as well as a small delegation of military historians and former soldiers who understood the significance of his wartime innovations. The memorial service included tributes from colleagues who had worked with Henderson for decades, emphasizing his contributions to precision manufacturing and his mentorship of younger engineers and machinists. However, the most meaningful tribute came from his grandson, who spoke about the mechanical precision and analytical thinking that Henderson had passed down through generations of his family, ensuring that his approach to problem-solving would continue long after his death. Henderson is remembered today primarily through military training programs that continue to teach the principles underlying his fractured scope technique, though modern equipment has eliminated the need for using damaged optical systems. The fundamental concepts of multi-perspective observation and mathematical analysis of ballistic problems remain central to advanced sniper training programs throughout the world. Modern military applications of Henderson's innovation can be seen in sophisticated optical equipment that provides multiple viewing angles simultaneously, advanced ballistic calculation systems that account for complex environmental variables, and training programs that emphasize systematic analysis of tactical problems. These developments represent the logical evolution of the principles that Henderson discovered through his accidental innovation with damaged equipment. The technique is currently taught at the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning, Georgia, where Henderson's story is used to illustrate the importance of creative problem-solving and the potential value of unconventional approaches to tactical challenges. Students learn not only the technical aspects of multi-perspective shooting but also the analytical methods that Henderson used to develop his mathematical solutions to complex ballistic problems. Physical memorials to Henderson's contributions include displays at the National Infantry Museum and the Smithsonian Institution, where his original fractured scope is exhibited alongside documentation of his tactical innovations. These displays emphasize the importance of individual creativity and analytical thinking in military operations, using Henderson's story to illustrate how unconventional solutions can achieve results that conventional methods cannot match. The ultimate lesson from Henderson's story extends beyond military applications to broader principles of innovation and problem-solving. His achievement demonstrates that apparent disadvantages can sometimes be transformed into significant advantages through creative analysis and systematic experimentation. This lesson has applications in engineering, science, and business, where breakthrough innovations often come from reconsidering assumptions about what constitutes proper equipment or correct procedures. Henderson's legacy also emphasizes the importance of mathematical precision and systematic observation in solving complex problems, whether in military operations or civilian applications. His background in precision manufacturing provided him with the analytical tools necessary to understand and exploit the optical phenomenon created by his damaged scope, suggesting that technical education and hands-on experience with precision systems can provide valuable problem-solving capabilities in unexpected contexts. The final accounting of Henderson's impact reveals numbers that justify his reputation as one of the most effective snipers in military history. During his 12-day period of peak effectiveness using the fractured scope technique, he achieved 127 confirmed kills, neutralized 23 key defensive positions, and created tactical opportunities that saved an estimated 340 American lives. These results represent a level of individual effectiveness that was 4 times greater than conventional sniper operations and established benchmarks for tactical innovation that continue to influence military doctrine today.